First of all, a warm welcome to all of you, and we're so pleased to see all of you. And so thank you for being here tonight. In capacity, it falls on me to introduce our speaker tonight. So I'm going to read an introduction. I am very happy to introduce our presenter, Haley Prochnow. Haley joined our board of directors in August 2022 and is helping us to begin digitizing and sharing our ed collection with the public. Beyond holding a position on our board, Haley has been working independently researching the Silverbrook mansion history since 2021. The 1895 mansion that used to stand within present-day Interstate Park served as a St. Croix Valley Country Club for residents of St. Paul's Rondo community in the 1950s and 1960s. Tonight, Haley will present us with a closer look at this time period, as well as the property construction to its demolition in 1974. We are looking forward to Haley's presentation of research tonight and future research projects in the future. Please join me in welcoming Haley.
So first of all, there are a lot of you. How am I sounding in the back? Can people hear me all the way? Up more. Okay, so we might need to adjust the volume. I will try to talk louder. Okay, so before we jump in, yes, thank you, Norm, for that introduction. I did join the St. Croix Falls Historical Society's board in August of 2022, so I'm fairly new to the organization. But I did start researching the Silverbrook property in 2021 after hiking the 2-mile loop trail in Interstate Park. And some of you may know that there's an audio tour that you can take as you're walking along the trail. But the history covered there really stops at the copper mining era and the era of prior to Interstate Park being developed. So that left a lot to be desired, and there was a lot for me to sort of dig into to find more property owners and find out more of the history of the property. So let's jump into it. Let's start with Silverbrook's origins. So Silverbrook was built in 1895 by Hezekiah Holbert, who was a wealthy grain broker from the Twin Cities. He didn't have a history in prospecting, but he had a really good idea that there might be mineral wealth and copper in the hills in the river valley. So he established the Holbert Mercantile and Mining Company, and he purchased 200 plus acres to sort of start this venture, as well as build himself a second home, which is the Silverbrook Mansion. So what you can see here is a couple of representations of Hezekiah Holbert. This photo here is his more professional portrait. And then the portrait in the middle is what I like to call his rugged individualist stage, where he was out in nature, trying to tame it, and make money off of it, essentially. And then lastly, his wife Fanny is located on the other side of the screen. So the Holberts were from St. Paul, Minnesota, and they lived on the famously affluent Summit Avenue. What you see here is a Google Maps screenshot from 2021, along with a photo of the house from 1971. So this house was their permanent residence. It had enough room for 7 children, 3 live-in servants, and Hezekiah Holbert's mother. This means that the Silverbrook Mansion that you see here was really their second home, which is crazy to think about. So this was a 19-room limestone mansion overlooking the St. Croix River, and it had its own natural waterfall that it overlooked as well. There was enough room here for the entire family, as well as servants' quarters located on the second floor. It also came with an equipped water system that would essentially take all of the spring water from the property and feed it into the house. So it was natural mineral water being fed into the house. Here you see an aerial view of the property from 1953. So we're jumping a little bit into the future, but this is just to give you some more context of how expansive this property was. So the little yellow circle you see on the screen is the actual mansion. Behind it is clear cut about 90 feet down to the St. Croix River. And then all around it where it's clear cut, that was the estate. So that had man-made trout ponds, artesian wells, and different things of leisure that they could do on the property. So as it probably comes as no surprise, there wasn't a lot of wealth to be made from copper in the hills. It was essentially a failed venture on Hezekiah Holbert's part, and by 1908, he was ready to be rid of Silverbrook. He wasn't spending time there, he wasn't making any money, and he sold the property to really what becomes like a string of wealthy landowners. There's not a lot known about this time in the early 1900s. There are rumors that the property was owned by somebody during Prohibition who was bootlegging alcohol. However, I haven't found anything to really point to that. But I'm sure a lot of people in this room probably have stories they could share with me that they had heard. But we are going to kind of jump ahead now. So looking at the time period of 1929 to 1942 is really significant in that we're looking at the property owners, Robert and Nina Payne, and they are the longest property owners of Silverbrook. So they did the most work on the property, they documented the property really well, and that's how we can really get an idea of how it really looked. This is a photo of Robert Payne and his dog. This is not inside Silverbrook, but I thought it was just too good of a photo not to include. So they were also from an affluent St. Paul neighborhood. They were from the McAllister Groveland neighborhood, if you're familiar with that. Their house is still standing today. It's really near McAllister College, if you're familiar with that area. They were an upper middle class family, again, purchasing Silverbrook to use it just as a summer playground for themselves. Here you see his wife Nina is at Silverbrook. She is standing next to the wading pond. If you hike out to the property today, you've probably noticed the circular stone foundation. It's actually this wading pond that they put in the 1930s. And then again, next to her is another photo of Robert with their prized pet. For whatever reason, these two loved putting their pets in all of their photographs, so you'll see some of that as we move forward. The other great thing about the Paynes is not only that they took lots of pictures, but Robert Payne actually wrote a complete guide detailing the property, the footprint, everything that we would want to know. He wrote about it. And he put it in this pamphlet that I found at Interstate Park. It's called Silverbrook on the St. Croix. So my guess is that he actually developed this in order to be able to sell the property. Just some of the language that he uses in the writing points to that. But in reading this, we find out some really incredible things. So not only was there a 19-room mansion, there was a 2-car garage, a stone tool house, a stone pump house for pumping the water, a water tower to house the water that went into the home, a stone barn, and then I think that's it, and the wells, and of course the trout ponds. So this was really an expansive property beyond the footprint of it just being a mansion. Some other things that Payne lets us know about in this booklet, he and his wife really outfitted the property with some modern amenities at the time. So they input radiator steam heat, they ran electricity to the property, which was difficult because the only way they could get electricity there was a special line from St. Croix Falls that went all the way out to where Silverbrook was. Outside of that, he writes about the springs having healing powers, so the natural water in that area, whatever minerals were in it, were said to be cathartic and to help heal ailments of the liver or stomach, which is so interesting because that story comes up in other areas of the river valley, of essentially the water having these healing properties. So also he does something great for us. He actually draws the complete blueprint of the house, so we can get an idea for what the inside looks like a little bit, for those of us who had never been inside. This is an expansive property with 5 bedrooms on the main floor, like you can see here. The best part is, and I know, I'm so sorry, people in the back cannot see this. On the back of the house, there's a 41-foot screened-in porch that overlooked the St. Croix River as well as the falls, the Silverbrook Falls that were probably about 50 feet away, and then the river, of course, 90 feet down. On the second floor, it's equally as grand. So there's a great hall that leads to a balcony. There's 2 more full bedrooms. The servants' quarters are on the second floor. And there's a sewing room and storage. So now I want to look at some of the Payne's great photography work, again, to really build the context for what we're talking about today. So this is a view from the lower trout pond of the mansion. And then here we can see the construction of the wading pool that I mentioned earlier. So it had a 20-foot fountain in the middle, if you can imagine that. And they put this in about 1930. This should look familiar to you. The columns that you see on either side of the driveway are still in the park till this day. Granted, they look a lot different. They're a little overgrown, but it is nice to see those remnants of the property in that way. So similarly to that last photo, or I guess alternately to that last photo, this is if we were up by Highway S, if you know where that is, and looking down toward the mansion. So north and down. I think it's really amazing to just see how much space that this house actually took up, especially when you go back there now and it's all natural area. This was an interesting choice of Robert Payne. He decided to give us this searchlight view, and he made special note that he took this photo at 10 p.m. at night. And it really just gives us an additional perspective of some of the details of the house and what it might have looked like. This, again, is another example of them using their pets to, I don't know, make cuter photos. So if you look closely, the dog is in the cab of the pickup truck. And if you look really closely, the pickup truck has detailing on it that says Silverbrook. So it definitely had its own branding as a complete estate. This is a special photo because this is the view from the back porch. So if we were standing on that 41-foot expansive back porch, this is what we would have seen at that point in time. And again, you go out there now, it's trees, you can't see the river until it's right in front of your face. So this is pretty special to be able to see. And now this is what the mansion would have looked like from Minnesota. So if we were standing on the other side of the river, we can see where the arrow is pointing. Here, I'll zoom in a little bit. That the mansion takes up a lot of the landscape. So this is something we're just not used to today, especially with the Wild and Scenic Act. We're not used to seeing big buildings jutting out off the top of the river bluffs or anything like that. So it definitely didn't blend in, and that was on purpose. So now that you have a better idea of what kind of expanse that the Silverbrook property really covered, again, it's on 200 acres. It goes beyond just being a 19-room limestone mansion. I want to focus specifically on the property owners during the 1950s and the early 1960s. After the Paynes owned the property, a family owned it. They were going to run it as a ski resort. Essentially, that only lasted for one season, and then that family sold the property again. So it's like a rotating door of property owners sort of selling off Silverbrook. But after that, Annabelle and James Rideau were the new proprietors and the owners of Silverbrook. And so we're going to look at them and their lives today, as well as what they did with this property. So when I first started this project, I reached out to Interstate Park and I was able to procure a typed property owner list. And it was, it was clearly homemade. There's lots of typos, lots of incorrect dates, things like that. But what really stood out to me was this listing of property owners as James and Annabelle Rideau. And all it says underneath it is that they operated a drinking club for blacks from the cities. And I was like, that seems really dismissive to me, and there must be more to this story. And so it's really that line that kicked off this interest, and that really fuels the rest of this story for me. So with a show of hands, and there are a lot of you here, I haven't forgot that, who's familiar with the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul? Okay, good. So a lot of you are familiar with that story. For those of you who aren't, I'm going to dive a little bit into the history of that neighborhood. And this is where James and Annabelle were from. So the Rondo neighborhood was in St. Paul, and it was home to 80% of St. Paul's African American population. It was a flourishing mixed income neighborhood with a really strong middle class. And outside of that, it was home to union halls, businesses, public gathering spaces, schools, community centers. I mean, it had everything that you would want in a great community. The other unique aspect of Rondo that we don't often talk about is that it was home to just an amazing amount of social and civic clubs. And really this came out of a need in the early 20th century because black residents weren't welcome in the restaurants, in the clubs, in the hotels that everybody else was. And so the safest and best place to go was Rondo, and to really commune with your neighbors and start your own social clubs. So today you will hear me talk a lot about this history of civic and social clubs. And I'll reference some of them, the Cameo Social Club, the Credjafon Social Club, and the Twin City 40 Club. They come up in this presentation today. This meant, they're self-organizing, these groups. This meant that meeting places sort of had to be ad hoc, right? So large groups of people, where do you meet? Community halls like this, or you're forced to meet at your church, or you're maybe meeting at homes of individuals, you're meeting in basements, backyards. You're finding the spaces where you can really exist as a community. So looking specifically at James first, James was born in Louisiana in 1906, and I don't know a lot about his venture north to St. Paul, but when he got here, he started working at the University Club and then later at the Town and Country Club in St. Paul. So if you're familiar with either of those clubs, they're still in existence today, and they are like the affluent country clubs that have been around forever in St. Paul. After his time working in country clubs, he went to work for the railroad, as many of the men in Rondo did at that time. and he was actually a Red Cap night captain. So the Red Caps were there to sort of help you navigate train travel at Union Depot when you came into St. Paul. One unique aspect of their job is that when black travelers would come in and they're like, where do I stay? Where am I welcome? Where am I safe? A Red Cap would often tell you, just go to Rondo. And specifically, Annabelle Rideau had a boarding house in Rondo for such kinds of travelers. So that's a really interesting piece of, they're there to do one thing, but they could also help residents find a place to stay. The other piece of James's life is that he was extremely spiritual and was a founding member of Camper United Methodist Church. And then later, he was on the board of trustees there. So he and Annabelle were really engaged in their church in that way. When James passed away in 1990, he was awarded a posthumous Roy Wilkins Award. And this is an award given by the NAACP for their dedication to the struggle of civil rights. So James won one of these awards, again, after he was deceased. But I think this really speaks to his character and really sort of, you'll see as I go through the presentation, he was very involved. The other thing I have on the screen, and I'm sure you can't read it, is James's World War II draft card, which again was one of the first things that I found when I started this project. There's three main pieces of information here. It states here that he was employed at the University Club at this time. His wife was Annabelle Rideau, and that his address was 707 Rondo Avenue. So this is Annabelle. This is lovely Annabelle. She was also born in 1906, but she was born in Alabama. She moved to Minnesota in the 20s, likely in search of opportunity. She had a lot of family members that had moved north as well. And the amazing thing about Annabelle is that very shortly after she arrives, her name starts appearing in the society columns of the newspaper. So she is everywhere in the St. Paul Recorder and the Minneapolis Spokesman. What we find is that she was a really gifted seamstress and teacher, and she taught community homemaking and sewing classes in the Rondo neighborhood. Some of her descendants told me that she possibly tailored suits for John Dillinger, which I thought was an interesting side note. I don't have any proof of that to share with you today, but that is pretty cool. Outside of her gifts, Annabelle was a member of so many things. So she was a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, which is the female version of the Shriners, the St. Anthony Hill Garden Club, the St. Paul Urban League, the Cameo Social Club, and then she was the Housing Committee Chair for the NAACP National Convention in 1960. So on top of her being incredibly civically engaged, she also owned a country club, which we're here to talk about today, and she operated and owned her own dress shop in the 1960s. So I don't know when she found the time to sleep, but she was everywhere. What you see here is Annabelle in the center, in the black dress, off-shoulder dress with the great smile. And this would have been around the time that she owned the country club. So this is a Cameo Club Christmas party that's depicted here. So around the same time that we're talking about today, Rondo was facing, I know, he's probably really embarrassed. Rondo was facing destruction, imminent destruction. So basically the city of St. Paul, in the name of urban planning, said, we want to put Interstate 94 right through the middle of Rondo. And that was the neighborhood they chose. And so what did this really look like? I mean, it sounds devastating, right? But what that meant is that 700 family homes were lost. On top of that, 300 businesses were either closed or torn down and forced to move. And to make matters worse, families were offered inadequate compensation for this forced relocation. Outside of monetary loss, we often don't think about things like public schools were torn down, public parks, the community centers that I talked about. All of this was destroyed in the name of urban renewal. So it left Rondo really reeling during this time period of 1956 to 1968, which then brings us to James and Annabelle's home. So I mentioned earlier that their address was listed as 707 Rondo Avenue, and this is really the only evidence of this home I could find. This is an old fire insurance map prior to the construction of I-94, where I was able to find their parcel, and I've circled it with a big yellow circle because it's pretty tiny to see. And then this, alternately, is where their house would be today. So it's pretty bleak looking at it here, but I'm really amazed with the way it was announced in the newspaper. So I'll read it to you. Come December 1st, Mr. and Mrs. James Rideau of 707 Rondo Avenue will be greeting their friends in their newly decorated and remodeled home at 765 Marshall Avenue. So I don't know about you, but that shows a lot of grace on the behalf of people who've been essentially forced to leave their home that they've had since the 30s, and then move to a new home. So all the while, this is a lot of lead up, but we're gonna go back to Silverbrook. James and Annabelle Rideau took this opportunity while the meeting places of Rondo were being shifted and demolished and all of this upheaval's going on. They opened a country club. So they decided, fine, we're gonna go out of the city and we're gonna open a gathering place in the St. Croix River Valley. Some of you might think, well, that's weird. You know, how did they decide on the doors in 1957? And I'll read you the kind of announcements that we've seen in the newspapers. So, the one that says St. Paul Spotlight. 30 Cameo members and guests thoroughly enjoyed a club meeting held at the beautiful St. Croix Valley Country Club, Saturday, August 17th. Mrs. James Rideau was hostess. The group assembled at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Harold Richardson, 871 Rondo, and journeyed to the club by bus. So they were organizing in St. Paul, and then they were coming up here and having an awesome time, which I think is just so great to read about. What did this really mean? So what could they do? So beyond just socializing, if you think about it, there was hiking, fishing, archery on site, and then what I've learned about Annabelle is that she loved to play games, and she always had a game of pinochle going on the back porch overlooking the St. Croix River, which is pretty cool. So now I want to focus on a really instrumental event that happened at the St. Croix Valley Country Club, or Silverbrook. What I found in my research is that in 1957, the St. Paul branch of the NAACP, they held a installation ceremony and celebration, which would have meant all the board members meet up and their invited guests, and they installed the new officers for the 1957 year. Outside of that ceremony, they also wanted to have an open discussion about the moral aspects of level. Outside of that, he was an avid activist for housing equity, which would have made sense what the topic was that night. And then the other man that you see here is Reverend Denzel Carty, who is also a board member at this time. He was also an activist for housing equity, but beyond that, fought for the desegregation of public schools and workplaces. And most interestingly, Reverend Carty in 1961 lobbies to the Minnesota State Legislature and actually gets the Minnesota Fair Housing Act passed. And so this prohibits discrimination in housing in Minnesota at that time. So we're going to take a little bit of a trip here, but the day after this installation ceremony at Silverbrook, Reverend Carty and Massey go back to St. Paul, where they are attending a meeting with Martin Luther King Jr., who had been speaking earlier that day at an engagement. And so the photo you see here is actually taken in Reverend Massey's home. He is seated next to Martin Luther King Jr., and behind him is Reverend Denzel Carty. And so I really include this photo not to suggest that MLK was hanging out at Silverbrook. There's no proof of that, but it's really to show you that the civil rights movement had so much momentum at this time in history, and it touched every corner of the United States. So not only did we have these really great local civil rights leaders, but they were connected on a national level, which I think really kind of hits home and connects us here in the St. Croix River Valley. So going back to the newspaper clips, again, there's just all of these events week after week of all these celebrations happening on the property. And for years, we're learning that there's birthday parties held here, club parties, there's debutantes hanging out. All of these wonderful and really positive events were happening. And in all of these newspaper clippings, we really get to know Annabelle. She was really the lifeblood behind this country club, and she has been described as the quintessential high society hostess. So this was really her venture and her dream. He wanted to hang out in the background, he wanted to go hunting, he didn't have any need for dressing up and like putting on airs. So, as I mentioned earlier, Annabelle is incredibly civically engaged, and one of those clubs is the Cameo Social Club, and this one is especially important to her history. So this club was actually started in the 1920s by Annabelle's sister, and then she later, when she moved to town, became involved. What you see here is points to Annabelle's kind of role in this Cameo Club. She was the chairwoman of the debutante cotillion that they had every year. So she was responsible for reaching out to parents in the Rondo community and saying, we think your daughter would be great for this program, and she lists off all the activities that they do as a part of the cotillion program. She hosted a charm school as a part of this, so teaching manners, more traditional manners, formal luncheon skills. And then the most interesting piece of this cotillion is that they would host a slumber party at the country club every year. So this meant that the debutantes got to get out of the city and have a weekend at the country club. So looking a little bit at the Cameo Club, you'll get a sense of how luxurious it was. They were hosting formal events, women in corsages and formals and costume jewelry. But their club motto is really, really good, and something I wanted to share with you all. So the Cameo Club motto is, "Down not the one that is down, cheer them up in their sorrow. This old world is a funny old world, and you may be down tomorrow." So this was really an organization that was about lifting one another up and celebrating one another. And it was unique in that men and women could join. So a lot of these social clubs, they would divide by the genders, they would, I don't know, whatever you didn't want your wife to know about, and vice versa. Nope, not with the Cameo Club, everybody was invited. One piece of this is, I spent a lot of time at the Minnesota Historical Society, And I don't think a lot of people know this, but they have a vast collection or an archive of donated materials from these social clubs that we're talking about today. And so what you see here is a personal scrapbook of somebody from the Cameo Social Club that was donated. And this is where I found a lot of my information. It's just this candid scrapbook, beautifully put together, but it holds so much history. So for anyone that's interested in historical research, if you can ever go to the Minnesota Historical Society, to the Gale Library, it's open to the public, it's free, and they have just a lot of amazing things there. So again, another aspect of the Cameo Club that was interesting to me is how it evolved over time. The picture you see on the right is an earlier photo of the club, probably in the 30s or 40s. And you notice they're kind of like rambunctiously meeting in a living room, having a good time. And then as attitudes shift, the club grows, everybody is a little older. Like the photo on the left here, Annabelle's in the front row, kind of lounging. But everybody is just formal to the nines, and they're in a rented ballroom at a hotel. So the club really grows and shifts in this lovely way over time. And here we have a photo taken on the 50th anniversary of Cameo Club in 1975. I put stars over James and Annabelle's heads so you could point them out easily or pick them out easily in the photo. Another thing that I found at the Gale Library was directly connected to the St. Croix Valley Country Club is this cotillion program of events from the year of 1958. So I'm well aware you can't read it from where you're at, but I will read it to you. What this entailed was a garden party, a luncheon, and then a slumber party at the St. Croix Valley Country Club. And the description of the slumber party is kind of interesting. So debutantes will remain at the country club following their luncheon. Sportswear is the favored style for the slumber party. You will be served in the evening and have breakfast in the morning on Sunday before leaving for the Twin Cities. There will be chaperones. So this was a no-nonsense program for these young ladies. So what we have here is the debutantes. So we haven't seen them yet. On the, I guess it would be your right-hand side of the screen, we see the debutantes actually inside Silverbrook. So this is the only known photo that I have of the inside of the mansion, and it's glorious. So they're all seated on the grand staircase on the first floor and smiling at the camera. This appeared in the newspaper to sort of announce that the cotillion program was underway for the season. After this slumber party, they would have traveled back to the Twin Cities, where they would have had the overall ball at the end of the season. And that's what we have here in this other photo. So this is from the 1960 cotillion ball. And we can see that it was very, very formal. Mary Kay Boyd is shown here in a white formal gown. The girls wore white. And then her date is dressed in tails. So that's a lot. That was a lot of joy, and a lot of great things happened at the Silverbrook Mansion as the St. Croix Valley Country Club. But ultimately, we know that it doesn't exist today. So imagine that you're James and Annabelle, and you work in the Twin Cities, you live in the Twin Cities, you're trying to run a business here, and your neighborhood is slowly being disassembled. Eventually it was just too much, and the proximity from St. Paul to here was too much to handle, and eventually they foreclosed on the property in 1962. All of that goes to say that this country club was clearly created out of love and probably what they wouldn't have called activism at the time, but really love for their community and providing a place where they could continue to be a community, essentially. So what we see here is the photo from 1974 that was in the local paper. It's a sad photo to look at. This is after a Los Angeles-based real estate developer purchased Silverbrook in the 60s. Vandals started to kind of wreak havoc on it. He hired a family to live there for a brief amount of time, but ultimately he ends up selling to the state of Wisconsin, who was looking to expand Interstate Park. So along with the mansion, they received that over 200 acres of land that we know as public land today. While the state owned it, however, it really, really fell into disrepair from what I've learned from a lot of people who lived here at that time. Someone even mentioned that a vandal chopped a hole in the roof so they could just light a fire in the middle of the floor, which seems bizarre to me. So by 1974, the state was sick of owning the property, sick of wondering what are we going to do with this huge mansion. And so ultimately that's what leads to the mansion being burned down and razed in that location. But again, those of you who have hiked out there, you can still see some of the remnants to this day. So we'll look at current day really quickly. I've included a few views here. So you can hike the trail from within Interstate Park, but then you can also locate the old driveway from Highway S. If you look really closely, the old limestone gates that lead down the driveway are still there, and you can hike down that as a part of the path. If you look really closely, you can see the remnants of the trout ponds that were man-made, as well as the artesian wells that were dug on the property. You have to do a little bit of digging, but once you find them, you're like, this is so amazing. This was part of something a lot bigger than this at one point in time. The other interesting aspect, and really the reason I think a lot of people hike that trail, is the falls that are promised at the end of the trail. They're not great, they're not grand right now, but from what I've heard, that when there was a water system on the property, the falls flowed really strong, and so strong that you could actually play behind them. So I spoke with Annabelle's grandsons, and they said when they were little boys, they would used to play kind of tag behind the waterfall, which is hard to imagine when you go out today. It's just a very peaceful, trickling waterfall. Again, the gates. So we saw the photos from the 30s earlier of the wonderful gates to the property. They are still there. They're graffitied, a little overgrown. They could use some love, but you can still see the driveway and kind of orient yourself to how that property looked at that time. I tried to take a photo of the foundation of that wading pond that you'll see when you're on the trail. A lot of people think it's a silo when you look at it, but now that you've been here, you know the true story, that it was a wading pond built in the 30s. So that takes us to, we have all this research. What am I going to do with it besides share it with all of you? I actually was lucky enough to hike the trail with Annabelle and James's descendants on Memorial Day of this past year. I met Annabelle's great-granddaughter, Sherelle, who is here hiding in the front row. I met her on Ancestry.com, which sounds so strange because that's not normally a place you really meet people that you're not related to and don't know. So we met on Ancestry, and it was kind of like a sign from the universe that she's working on a documentary right now about her ancestry and her healing process with that. So I went along with the family on a hike, and I got to learn a lot of the really cool history from Sherelle's uncles who spent time on the property. So with that, I want to kind of segue into, we have all this research, what can we do with it? Well, I'm using it to support Sherelle's effort. And as a part of that, I want to show you what she's working on. So I just shared with you all the stuff I've been doing, but what does this look like for Sherelle, who's exploring her ancestry? And I'm going to play the trailer for her film.
When people ask me where I'm from, and I tell them Minnesota, they usually respond, I didn't know there were black people in Minnesota. The other go-to response, you're the first black person I've met from Minnesota. Or, ain't that where Prince is from? It's 2021. Don't people know black people are everywhere? But how did black people get to Minnesota? From a young age, I remember hearing stories about my great-grandmother, as if her life were a fable. As I became older, I started to notice that much of my ancestors' history had been lost or romanticized, and there was still so much more to uncover. Through my investigations and conversations with family and friends, I learned more about my family's legacy before arriving to Minnesota. Really, their journey to St. Paul is part of a larger voyage of the Great Migration, which many Black Americans share. It's within exploring that curiosity I traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, to more deeply connect with the land, the heritage, the history, and the culture from which our ancestors came. While I journey into my own healing, I hope to empower other African Americans to connect with the light and dark of our past. As Black people in America, our history is complicated, oftentimes not affording us the privilege to preserve it or even recall it. But through this journey, I am reminded of the words of Maya Angelou. I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. Through grounding myself in the presence of the past, I feel their endurance and strength within me, encouraging me to open doors they couldn't and to connect to their power so future generations can hold tight to a heritage and history that American society has tried to take away from us. I'm not sure all I might uncover on this journey or if I'll ever think about home the same way again. But two things are for sure. There are Black people in Minnesota and we are healing.
And with that, Sherelle, would you close us out with a few comments, if you're comfortable with it?
Yeah, round of applause for Haley. Keep this brief here. I'm gonna jump onto this cord.
Okay. Okay, so it's really rare to come across a Haley Prochnow while documenting your own ancestral healing journey, and for that I feel so grateful and grateful for everybody here today. I was always so fascinated by the story of my great-grandmother, and I could always feel her spirit living within me, but it wasn't really until I met Haley that I felt like I knew the nuances of her story, of her life, and just the magnitude of the impact that she made on others. And so while we were able to highlight so much of the high society that she represented in her own journey today, the reason it's a healing journey for me is because for decades and decades and decades, a lot of these stories I could never get from my family, from my aunts, from my uncles, because there were so many sensitivities around it. It's still really heartbreaking, the story of the Rondo community, and then learning really how the St. Croix Valley Country Club also was foreclosed for her is just a reminder of why you have to dig so deep sometimes to get those stories. And so, taking a little bit of the burden off of me, Haley did a lot of this hard work, and I hope that you all had the chance to read her article that was in the St. Croix 360 that dives even deeper into a lot of this research. And when I was telling some of the folks that are working in the Rondo Reconnect initiative right now, they're working on an initiative to make a land bridge over where 494 is. It's a long way from being complete right now. It's still an idea, but they're putting a lot of momentum and resources behind it. And as I was exploring that movement with them, Keith Baker, the executive director, was telling me a lot about how he wishes he would have known this story, because he used to bring a lot of African Americans from the Rondo community to St. Paul. And there's also stories of a slave from 1860, an enslaved woman, shall I say, named Eliza Winston, who actually gained her freedom coming to Wisconsin when she was brought up from her slave owner in Mississippi, and was supported by abolitionists during that time, and was whisked up to Canada to find her own liberty. And 100 years later, it's so beautiful to know that my great-grandmother, who, as I was on Ancestry.com researching our own family history, I know that my great-grandmother's grandmother, my fourth grandmother, was looking at her, she lived her life as a domestic servant in Selma, Alabama, and 100 years later, her sweet baby great-granddaughter was able to provide a place of respite and community for the Black hardworking class that just wanted to have some fun and have a place to get away themselves in St. Croix. So I've been blessed for the opportunity to investigate this history for my family, and I'm thankful for Haley and all of you for being here today on this journey. We do have some heirlooms of my great-grandmothers that we brought today, including this French provincial table, this fancy vase thing that I don't know. And then we have some more photos as well from the debutante cotillions and other events that happened at Silverbrook, if you want to finger through those.
Well, that's all I have for you, but I do want to sort of plug the Historical Society for a moment. So many of you have showed up today from this area, and I'm so thankful for that. And if you want more programming like this in the future and more access to history like this, I really would encourage you to become members of the St. Croix Falls Historical Society. And we have some forms as you're walking out the door. If you're interested, just pick one up and send one in. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Haley, for that wonderful program. Very riveting. These programs have been a part of our past as well as our future. And I'd like to recognize a person tonight that is responsible not only for our Historical Society here in St. Croix Falls, but a past president that served us for so many years and did such a great job, Mr. Duran Blandy. Thank you, Duran, for all of you did for us. And I think that concludes our program tonight, and thank you all for coming.